That is Federal Defense Minister Bill Blair talking to reporters on his way into cabinet earlier this morning, explicitly saying essentially that Hamas cannot be trusted to keep up its end of a supposed ceasefire. Now, a few hours later, Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly tweeted out that she was looking for, and you can see the tweet there, a civilian is a civilian. We need more humanitarian aid, she wrote, entering Gaza, and for Canadians to be able to exit. For this reason, we are calling for humanitarian pauses on hostilities to be considered. So how to make sense of that back and forth? Here to help us do that is the front bench. With me this evening, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. I wanted to start there because that sort of shows you the evolution of the day in which, Lisa, I'll start with you. Bill Blair was pretty unequivocal about, you know, a response to these calls for a more a wider ceasefire. And then Melanie Joly is tweeting about humanitarian pauses. I will say we asked for the government to clarify, to come on the show and clarify exactly what they meant by that. They declined our request. We weren't able to get any minister on. But I'm wondering what you think of that evolution and sort of the government's position on this.
I don't have anything to think about in terms of the evolution. I would just say that if there is a moment in time when we need to have absolute clarity on what a government is saying, it has to be this moment. I don't know any moment greater than what's happening right now with respect to Israel and Hamas and the fighting that continues on. And to try to wordsmith things so that you're not putting off a certain voter in the country. My goodness, shake your head, look in the mirror, make the right decision and move on. And don't have one minister coming out in the morning saying that he doesn't believe a ceasefire is even possible. And then another minister changing the term of ceasefire to think that that's even better. And I didn't even get started about what Bob Rae is doing in terms of what he's saying at the UN. This is a collapse. It's a catastrophe in terms of the government understanding what their message is. And it just breeds confusion in the rest of Canada.
I mean, to a certain degree, Brian, I do understand, I see the calls from France and the U.S. for this idea of a humanitarian pause. I don't know because no one will come on and explain. I think what it means is, you know, stop for a moment so more stuff can get into Gaza and more stuff to get out. But the same question could be presented to them as with a wider ceasefire. How would you entrust a terrorist organization essentially to uphold its end of that bargain?
Well, I think you're describing exactly sort of what they're wrestling with. My sense, and this is really just me reading the news, listening to clips. I mean, I think Minister Blair came out with what the position of the government was earlier today. Minister Joly is actually in meetings abroad, starting to hear the term, as you mentioned, Vassy, from the U.S. And other allies and other people that are trying to sort of figure out how to get civilians and foreign nationals out of the region. This idea of a humanitarian pause, I don't think it's Minister Joly that started that train, so it's others that did. So she, in the meeting, sort of in real time, is saying this is something that, at least in her opinion, it looks like that the government could support. So I definitely, in real time, things are shifting a bit, but I mean, that's the situation we find ourselves in. I think it's as much due to the idea that people are meeting and actively trying to figure out ways to address the humanitarian crisis that has been caused by this. And the idea of a humanitarian pause, I don't know exactly the ins and outs and the differences between a ceasefire, but it does sound to me like the idea is that we're just going to pause things so we can get the aid that people need in the region and, of course, get foreign nationals and citizens out and get them to safety as much as possible. Instead, to your point again, Vassy, of asking people to rely on Hamas to respect a ceasefire, where Minister Blair, probably rightfully so, saying that he just strongly doubts that will happen.
I think also, Tom, and I'd for sure like your analysis on this. You know, if you say ceasefire without attaching humanitarian needs to it, I mean, that has a very loaded term, right? It has very direct implications for what you feel Israel is entitled to do, and could potentially have much wider consequences, obviously, if you did make that assertion. In using the language humanitarian pause, my guess is their objective is to, you know, focus that on the issue of humanitarian needs. But to Lisa's point, like, unless you're unequivocal one way or the other, it provides a bit of a vacuum for this kind of a discussion.
Extremely well said, Vassy. I think that's exactly it. I mean, it starts with Bill Blair saying the obvious, that Hamas has to be eliminated as a terrorist force. But then we move into this mushy middle where we're not calling quite, as you say, for a ceasefire, because that would almost mean that we're asking Israel to stand down after these horrific terrorist attacks that cost the lives of well over 1,000 Israeli children and elderly and people at a music festival and so forth, and 5,000 missiles raining down on civilian targets in Israel. So at what point do you call for a ceasefire when you're faced with that and you have to deal with it in the real world? You also want to make sure that you're not doing something that long-term will mean that the young people who are in Gaza now will have nothing to fall back on if and when Hamas is finally dismantled as a fighting force. You don't want it only to be memories of revenge and getting back. So there is a need for a humanitarian answer, but we're watching the trucks roll through day after day. Could there be more? I don't see much military activity around those trucks at Rafah, at that border crossing between Egypt and Gaza, but at the very least, if they're reassured with regard to that, that's fine. But if ceasefire, as you say, Vassy, means that Israel should stand in abeyance for its right to defend itself, I don't think that there are a lot of people who are aware of what Israel's been through since October 7th who would agree with that.
Yeah, and Rob, to be clear, nobody in the government has said or advocated at this point for a ceasefire. The confusion kind of arises over maybe if they were to attach more clarity to what they mean by a tweet, right, or whatever you want to call it on X, or to the term that they're using, they could help, dissipate some of the backlash or some of the conversation that arises as a result.
Well, exactly, Vassy. And hasn't Melanie Joly's Twitter feed been a source of consternation already in this war? I mean, there was the tweet out there that, for a long time after it had been established that this was not the case. She had a tweet basically blaming that hospital bombing on Israeli rockets when Canada's finally come around to the position that President Joe Biden came to last week, that it wasn't. It was a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket. So I think this diplomacy by Twitter.
She didn't say Israel, just to be clear. She didn't say Israel, but the implication was because she said the bomb on a hospital contravened international law.
Yeah, and she inferred it. She certainly inferred it. It was ambiguous enough that it was a source of consternation. And this is the problem with diplomacy by Twitter. I mean, I'm going to go with what the Minister of Defense said because he was a real live person in front of reporters, not a person doing the foreign minister's social media feed. Because Melanie Joly isn't on her iPhone tweeting from her meetings.
What do you think about the use of social media, Lisa? I mean, you've been a cabinet minister, especially in an instance like this. Is it necessary to put out your position on a platform like Twitter, or can you wait until you can get in front of a camera?
I don't think you can wait. I think you do have to put your position out because these things are moving at the speed of light, literally. But you have to be careful. And, Benzie's right. I mean, it's not necessarily the minister putting out the tweet or the X or whatever the short term of that is called, but it's certainly somebody within their staff that's doing it, interpreting what the minister has said, and maybe not exactly thinking through what else has been said in that day. I'm really glad that Rob also brought up the fact that there has been all of kinds of, I would say, miscommunication when it comes to what happened in that hospital incident. And Canada has suffered as a result. We were the last ones to declare that our own independent review on Saturday night at 10 o'clock, by the way, has been concluded, and it's everything's okay. We agree with every other G7 country on the conclusion. I mean, that to me just shows we're struggling on communicating in this part, and maybe because the government doesn't know where it stands, truly doesn't know where it stands.
What is your impression about that, Brian? Because I think what we have also been talking about for the past week is the fact that a group of MPs, for example, 20 of whom are Liberals, wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister asking for a ceasefire. Like there is, and you all predicted this weeks ago when the war broke out, there is discord among the government's caucus. Not everybody is on the exact same page. Do you think that has lent itself to a less clear position from the government, or do you also think that maybe they don't know exactly what their position is?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are definitely factors. But again, I think we all like to believe that Canada is the one sort of leading the charge in some of these things. But today it sounds like to me that, again, the U.S. and others started to talk about this idea of humanitarian pause, and Canada follows suit. And the Minister Joly in this case saw a bit of a chance to express support for that idea, and she took it. And she took it on Twitter. So whether that was worded the right way because it was a staffer, whether it was vetted by the centre and the Prime Minister's office, that I don't know. But I think it's also because we see some of our allies and some of those that we know are trying to thoughtfully find ways to help this humanitarian crisis deal with it. So I also think there's a bit of that going on. So that obviously means that when Minister Blair spoke this morning, that probably wasn't really on top of mind or even discussed yet with him. Minister Joly's in a meeting hearing about this and kind of comes out right away to say it. I mean, I think Benzie and Lisa's points are both right. I mean, the idea that we kind of do foreign policy through Twitter or X is not necessarily ideal. But to Lisa's point, if you don't, people are going to hear about this stuff and they're going to hear probably erroneous facts and things that will sort of get the message out there in an even more murky way. So you really got to find a way to communicate as rapidly as possible. So Minister Joly probably did that. Did they coordinate? Clearly not. Or did they just quickly kind of change their tune a little bit and say we can jump on this humanitarian pause thing and support it? Yes, but I think it goes to the fact that it's not Canada leading the charge in this. We're obviously in governments and everybody's going to look like, try to make it look like we're right in the middle of it. I mean, we're obviously supporting. There's things that we can do, no question, but obviously there's others that are taking stakes and that has an impact on our foreign policy for sure.